welcome to this event, which we're doing in collaboration with the United Nations Secretary General's task force that Simon was leading and doing the secretariat work and all the hard work around. We have a gallery of fantastic speakers on a subject that's important. The future of digital finance and whether it can deliver social value more than our current financial system. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Simon. Simon's been in the sustainability and corporate responsibility space for probably longer than he can remember. And he's done a number of things related to finance for sustainability and for social purpose. He led United Nations Environment Programme inquiry on creating a sustainable financial system, and now is running the Secretariat and leading on the United Nations Secretary General's task force of aligning digital finance with the Sustainable Development Goals. So he's got a breadth of experience and has managed to put together a wonderful panel for us to listen to. A panel that Simon will introduce as he moderates this session. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much, Joe, and good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are. There does come a sort of tipping point in one's life where these sort of extended historical narratives, give one a sense of imminent decline and demise. But I'm not quite there yet. And the digital finance work that I've been involved in has certainly sparked not only my, but also the interests of many. For those who read the Financial Times or other financial press, you'll know that one of the largest IPOs this year and forever will be what is now known as the Ant Group, which is the Alipay equivalent spin out from Alibaba. I think, Roger, you'll give us better data on this, but I think they're valuing it at about $350 billion all told. And I think one can expect that number to rise. When we talk about fintech, we often think about lots of funky young individuals sitting in offices in California inventing hairy and scary new ways of moving money around at great pace, occasionally with a sort of social face. And I guess we think much less about the fact that digitalization also drives very rapid market concentration, these very large fintech platforms that have begun to emerge, spilling out not only from the financial sector, but from also the social media space and elsewhere. How digitalization disrupts finance, both public and private finance, obviously impacts on many aspects of our lives. We can use our phones to pay for simple things very quickly. In China, we can take 1 RMB, 20 US cents, and place it in a money market for 3 seconds and then withdraw it again and see how much money we've made. Clearly, there are many immediate consumer benefits to be gained, and many of them are benefits that we enjoy. But what are the broader implications? And is fintech just another variant of finance, or something that either has inherent or possible ways in which it can sort of support the good, whether the good is framed in terms of the more sort of official sustainable development goals, or whether it's framed in more immediate localized ways. That's pretty much the topic of the session that we're going to go through today, and we've got a fantastic panel to address that. I'm going to do like a 30-second intro of each and then really kick off into the first round. So Roger Gifford, Sir Roger, sits with his day job working for SEB, European Bank, and in his off time, he has helped to drive forward the green finance agenda, both in the City of London and elsewhere, as well as doing many other things. Louise Wilson runs, I'm not even sure anymore, Louise, whether you're going to call it a fintech company or something completely different. I suspect something completely different, but runs Abundance UK, which is the UK's largest crowdsourcing platform, and I think has some extraordinary experience to narrate that kind of takes us beyond what many of us may think of crowdsourcing as being a sort of little minor activity kind of in the corner. And Marianne Haar is the executive director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance, a public-private partnership based in Geneva, and has had the opportunity to lead that organization over the last 2 or 3 years in exploring many facets of digital finance and the way in which it can impact sustainable development outcomes. So we have a absolutely perfect panel to take us sort of through the paces of this topic. And I'm going to start off, if I may, Sir Roger, with yourself. Perhaps you could sort of tee up the conversation that we're going to have.
Thank you, Simon, and how very nice to be part of this panel and to see you all there. Simon, I have now switched my Wi-Fi, so I should be on a better line, but if I start fading or something, just wave furiously at me. You've asked me to talk about the need for which a digital solution could be helpful or even enabling, particularly in the green space, which I think is probably more my forte. And to keep it simple, I'm going to mention just 3, the famous power of 3, where real behavioral change is needed and where I think digital financial techniques will play a part. They are power, produce, and travel, famous power of 3, and there are many others I know, but for now I will focus on just those. On power, the reason that digital financial technology is so relevant to this discussion is that technology is what the green revolution is all about. It's being propelled by social consent, by scientific data, by government action, not least by the UNEP and others. But at its heart, we're talking about technology and about risk management, about commercial opportunity. And if we can bring this to the retail individual level, as we're planning at the Green Finance Institute to do, then we have some real opportunities to harness AI and digital finance in their broader sense. The technical revolution in power production is well underway. It can't go quick enough. So anything that helps that along, of course, is very welcome. And it's a technical story because the climate crisis is a technical failure. Many countries in Asia, not just China, rapidly growing post-war, encouraged by us all, we all benefited, let's be completely honest, but the energy, clean energy, failed to keep up with those ambitions. Nuclear powers failed to deliver, renewables have only recently come on the scene. In fact, the only viable energy source for national aspirations around the globe has been fossil until very recently, and is still primarily fossil for all that growth ambition that we are so keen to encourage, which makes developing that technology of renewables and their potential very relevant. And they're showing clearly the growth patterns identical to those seen in earlier product revolutions. And the natural question comes, how can we get them embedded into the system as quickly as possible? New energy technologies are now seen to be superior to the incumbents. Even in the absence of a climate reason, one can argue that markets would drive the rapid expansion of these technologies, pushing down prices at the same time. It's already happening. In solar, wind, batteries coming, hydrogen, probably, ammonia, very possibly. Typically, product revolutions take a 30-year incubation period, followed by a 30-year period of disruption, followed by another 30 of stabilization. IT started about 60 years ago, only really got going in the 90s. We're about 30 years into that, and there's signs of maturity coming. The first 30 years of incubation see technology developed below the radar until cost or efficiency parity is reached. Product revolutions often seem to start with a sort of killer application, inspiring followers and creative engineers along the way, like the Carnegie Steelworks of 1875, the Ford Model T in 1914, the IBM Personal Computer at the beginning of the 80s, and the Tesla Model S of 2012. Incubation is followed by a period of exploding volumes, unit price declines, and soaring profits for the new monopolies. Then there's a period of stabilization, which sees greatly increased regulation to make sure that the gains are passed on to customers, and the traditional excesses of capitalist innovation are taxed. I think we're just entering that third period with IT now and all the tax discussions we're having about the 4 American majors. With renewable energy, we're approaching the second phase of disruption with the usual business and political challenges that encompasses. But the key is this: for any investor, buying into better technologies on a falling cost curve and embedding those factors into your business model has always been a driver of long-term competitive advantage. And we are at exactly that stage the second phase of disruption in energy, when techniques like digital finance or like handheld ability to control your carbon output or whatever it is will be looked at and will be coming on the scene. This cycle of revolution is the same with chips, with processors, with mass production technologies, first wave of electrification, even cars and steam engines. It's amazing how easily they fit into this model. And whilst the growth of renewable energy is impressive, all the scientific evidence suggests it's not fast enough, and we need to move much faster before a climate crisis hits us, so we're told. I argue that the technology is going to drive this market anyway. Whether you believe in climate crisis or not, doesn't really matter, because it's a commercial opportunity. But there is a very powerful social incentive for societies and companies to speed up the transition process. Politicians know this, and one can reasonably expect digital solutions to help make it happen. It's worth noting that the environmental movement has moved, crucially, from the environmentalists to business and commerce and finance, and now to government, with endless commitments to net zero. These will mean something very particular as we go along. Of course, the big focus in the net zero debate so far has been on emissions, in particular emissions from coal and gas-fired power stations and from vehicles, aviation and shipping. It's only half the story, because the carbon in the atmosphere is the balance of emissions and the take-up of carbon by nature, vegetation, salt marshes and the oceans. And by burning down the rainforests and stripping the carbon from the soils, we're messing up the ability of nature to do its job. And what we eat and what we wear, and where those items come from, it's been of concern for many years, but that is now beginning to hit the financial agenda too. Biodiversity loss is rising up the agenda. Well, it's been there for years, but we haven't found a way before to use financial influence to affect what companies are doing and the food we eat and what the clothes that we wear. Again, note the role of investors here, that nobody likes greenwashing, no one likes product sourcing scandals, not in Leicester or Indonesia or anywhere. So the ability of media and digital techniques of information will also play a key role in our fight against biodiversity loss. I might mention briefly a major review coming out this autumn on the economics of biodiversity loss by Professor Partha Dasgupta of Cambridge University. I'm delighted to sit on that panel, and that will be a very interesting read, I think, Simon, when it comes out. It sets out a formal framework that reflects that we and our economies are embedded in the biosphere. The framework sees biodiversity loss as an asset management challenge, because nature is an asset on which our economies, our livelihoods all rely, yet the asset is being seriously mismanaged to the extent that our demands on nature far exceed its capacity to supply on a sustainable basis. This is a problem which has been called, Partha calls it the greatest institutional failure the world has ever seen. And I think it's probably right. It's a global problem, and we are absolutely mishandling it. Over-extraction and pollution, it depletes stocks of natural capital in quality or in quantity, and they affect the abiotic environment. This obviously decreases the ability of ecosystems to provide those services. Over the past 70 years, there have been profound losses in biodiversity across continents and biomes, and of course, dramatic changes in the biosphere, which is what the green finance has particularly been focusing on before. So reducing our demands will require us not only to improve the efficiency with which we consume, it will also require us to move towards fair and sustainable and provable and transparent consumption and production patterns. And I think that the digital finance, digital technology will be very interesting for that transparency process going forwards. Finally, just to mention it, travel, from shipping to trucking to cars, real progress is being called for, and I think it's being made, again, at a technical level. Hydrogen, ammonia, there's a race on here with China, of course, Germany, Japan, the UK, all very keen to find a solution because they know it will be a commercial winner. When the electric vehicle market really takes off, there will then be opportunities for digital information of all sorts, I'm sure. But in all three areas, how we consume carbon, how we measure that, how we attach that information to a Fitbit, the possibilities are there to bring home the reality of carbon consumption on a personal level in all the areas I've touched on. And I'll leave it there.
Roger, we asked you at the outset to kind of set up the problem or the opportunity or the challenge, and you've done an absolutely perfect job of it. So I'm going to just hold that exactly as you presented it and move straight on to Louise, and then bring in Marianne, maybe sort of tying in more effectively kind of where the digital finance disruption nexus kind of feeds into addressing the challenges and opportunities you've described. Louise, over to you. You're still on mute.
Yeah, here we go. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Roger, for setting that scene. And maybe I'm going to kind of hone in on the topic, kind of social value of digital finance and what it means from our perspective. And Simon, as you said, we're a crowdfunding platform, a direct investment platform. Thank you for making us the biggest. We're not quite, but we could say we're the biggest focused on social and sustainable infrastructure. So absolutely right at the heart of what we do is all about the purpose within money, not just the end investment. And I think that's kind of really key to this discussion. And if we look at what's happening in finance at the moment, I talk a lot about, well, actually, there is a lot of talk about ESG and the fact that that's the biggest trend in the history of investing ever, by virtue of the fact that finance is bigger than it's ever been. But it is absolutely the proof, if you like, of how far finance has become out of step with what we value and our very finite planet, as Roger alluded to. So, that we need to have this as a sort of a theme to kind of remind people about what money and investing is for. And the system has become so big that you can use the analogy of the oil tanker, or any tanker, it doesn't have to just be oil, that it takes 6 miles to shift its course. But what we see as that kind of potential, if you like, within digital finance is that it has the ability to reduce that period of time. That once that pendulum starts to swing, which it is, then actually it can begin to move very quickly. And in some ways, I like to be kind of very optimistic about actually the role that finance, wealth, and investing can have to actually address some of our most significant problems. And from our perspective, climate is very much at the top of it. If we don't address this climate problem, then really we're kind of wasting our time on trying to fix any of the others. And why do I feel kind of so positive, if you like, about the potential of that digitization of finance? It's because it allows hundreds of thousands and millions and billions of more people to be the active political actor in the system. If money makes the world go round, actually what we need now is to have as many people as possible acting directly within that system. And abundance is a complete case in point in that. Our minimum investment is £5. There's no way that we could deliver that if we were operating in a paper-based world. So, so I guess to bring that all together, that digitization, like I say, it's an enabler of millions and billions of people to be the political actor in terms of every pound, dollar, yen, euro that they invest being very much the statement for the world that they want going forward, and for generally something that we all share, that we want to leave the world in a better place than we found it. And we seem to have lost that. Well, we've lost it to here, but now that is really starting to change, and the pandemic seems to have reinforced it, and the digitization of finance can help make that change happen much more quickly than it would do otherwise. And I'll leave it there.
Louise, thank you. I'm not going to let you leave it quite there, because I want to come back with a question just to kind of tease out a little bit the proposition. So, you're leveraging your experience in not quite the largest UK crowdsourcing platform in arguing that if citizens have more choice, they have more control over their own money, then they're going to make sort of pro-good decisions. And I guess there are sort of two questions in that I'm willing to be convinced by, but perhaps others need a little bit more convincing. The first is, there are an awful lot of people. Are they all going to decide on what to do with their $50? Is this 8 billion people all deciding whether to build a bridge or not, or how to leverage trillions of dollars? How does one scale this story? Since the direct financing, I understand if it's relatively small scale and highly distributed, but don't really understand at a much larger scale. And obviously the second question is, particularly if people are up against the wall, doesn't Maslow's hierarchy count? That they'll focus on financial returns because that's the thing that's most important to them, you know, in the context of their immediate economic needs. And perhaps those are, you know, it's not intentionally cynical or skeptical, but I think it's good for you to just take us to the next level in your argument.
Yeah. So I'm going to do your second question first. I just saw literally before I came on this call, this session. So, and I mentioned it in my final closing comments, but a bit of a throwaway, but to focus in on it, that pandemic has strengthened people's resolve to want to address climate emergency. And first of all, in the UK anyway, and I appreciate that this is a quite UK perspective, and it's not necessarily true. I think it's true within Europe, but it's not necessarily true in some parts of the world. But still, I think these things begin to travel much more quickly again than they used to. But since lockdown started, the Google search for sustainable investing is up 119%. And the Investments Association has, for the last three out of the last 4 months with available data, I don't know what that qualification is, but they have seen £900 million a month moving into responsible investments. So in some ways, that to me is the strongest point, that people are really waking up to the fact that they want purpose to go hand in hand with profit. And the issue has been actually largely to date that no one's really asked people that question. And now, when I say no one, I mean within the finance sector, we separated what our money does financially from what it does physically, if you like. And now that is beginning to be bridged. And abundance is all about that. We've always been about that, but it's starting to happen at different layers within the system, hopefully to everybody's benefit. So that would be the kind of comments just pointing to the data in terms of how actually Maslow's hierarchy of needs is putting people and planet up there with financial return. And then the second one, in terms of I think to summarize your question, you're kind of saying, well, you know, okay, that's all very well, but how does, you know, a few people investing their 50 quid in a different way really move the needle? Is that a fair summary?
And I guess, to be true to the topic of the seminar, kind of where does digital play a role?
So revolutions are started by people, and you know, ultimately, and I use the phrase political actor. You know, we the kind of big finance might be all chasing after ESG, but the only reason it's chasing after ESG is because ultimately the push for it, the demand for it, is coming from individuals. So during 2019. We saw, you know, a number of these grassroots movements, and very global, with the school climate strike being probably the most powerful one, but things like Extinction Rebellion overlaid on that, really combining as to deliver net zero as these legislated objectives now in a number of countries, and a growing number of countries. That wouldn't have happened without people demanding that change. And also, you know, pushing on an open door, because some of the groundwork have been laid by central bankers, you know, Mark Carney and a number of others leading the way from the top down, and grass movements from the bottom up. But the digital aspect of that, you know, the school climate strike, the only reason that became a global movement is because of a digital world.
Right. Okay, then just hold it there for 2 seconds and let me swing across to Marianne. Marianne, I'm sort of beginning to piece together the story. You know, kind of Roger has set up the dartboard, so we know what we need to do. Louise is saying it's got something to do with people, and kind of people can be empowered to make decisions over the use of their own money through a number of different means. The pandemic has accelerated it, and digital might help. Kind of, Marianne, help us fill in the gaps. Kind of, where does fintech really come into this story? Or is it just a sort of, yes, that's interesting too?
Thanks a lot. It's a good story to build on. Perfect. So we heard from Sir Roger that we have in the real economy the assets out there, renewable assets at least, because there's a business case to it. And we heard from Luis also the other part of the story, which is that individuals drive change. So if we look at the comparative advantage of fintech, it's exactly there, actually. And that's what's going on at the moment, is that a number of these renewable assets or green assets in the real economy are currently, a lot of them are not big enough to travel to capital markets or live up to capital markets requirements as we know them. So there is where we see quite a lot of fintech use cases to issue, to make it cost efficient, to issue capital market instrument or debt instruments at lower transaction costs. So that's where we see regulated STOs that came out of Germany. Mainly the underlying assets of those are either SMEs that have been automatically credit scored. So you have had that cost efficient way of sort of structuring the asset, getting the information to issue the bond, or it's renewable assets. It's solar cells that are bundled together, and then you have a digital bond that's issued mainly by a digital platform, and often sometimes with a banking partner. So we see partly that fintech is going in and correcting the failure that capital markets do not respond to the needs of smaller assets, and many of the green assets are smaller because it's a new economy. And then also, like Louise said, that individuals have to more and more extent green desires and green wishes for themselves and their children, and they really want to put their money into that. But what we are seeing is that where we need the capital flows most, the countries are getting low credit ratings. So getting access to capital markets have come with high costs and high indebtedness, as we see in COVID-19 situation of sovereign debt levels rising to an unsustainable level. So what we've seen with the first sort of generation of this thinking was that the Central Bank of Kenya issued the Akiba on a mobile platform, which was basically offering to citizens to also become investors in government securities, and for the state to start to build a savings culture so they don't have to be constantly dependent on capital markets where the cost of capital is 7-8% if you're Kenya, and it's less than 1% if you're the US. And we're seeing this being replicated across a number of states. So we've seen the first green retail sukuk being issued by Indonesia not long ago. And then the last one we've saw is with the Central Bank of Thailand that issued, even on a very advanced technology, so on digital distributed ledger technology, exactly a citizen's government security. And then the motivation for using DOT is that then they could invite the unbanked in the country even to become investors into government securities. So those are the two levels of capital markets where we're currently seeing fintech running the fastest in terms of trying to really get capital flows into the assets where it's needed. And then if we look at the retail level, as so Roger also pointed out, that we need sort of a real behavioral shift and revolution. When we turn to mobile money platforms, your transaction comes with a pretty thick data profile. So it can, and that can turn into sort of reinventing how you engage with money and with mobile money platforms. And there we saw, as you mentioned in the beginning, Simon, that we're just having the IPO of the Ant Group, which is also representative of the largest green fintech solution, which is basically AI. If you download this functionality, AI Ant Forest, then you invite algorithms to automatically give you an automated carbon footprint on 18 of your behaviors. So whether you choose the bike or the car today, you get an automated footprint. And then if you decrease that, you earn green energy points on the platform. And then that you could say, okay, there are quite a number of these types of green behavioral initiatives, but what is special about this is that it's so scaled. So it's 550 million people that are currently receiving these green energy points on their everyday behaviors. And they've basically turned it into a community where you can, it's gamified, so you can steal the green energy points of your friend, and they have rankings every day of who has earned the most, who has the most carbon light lifestyle. And then you turn your green energy points into a real impact. So you get a tree planted in the Inner Mongolia, and you have real life proof of impact. So drones taking pictures of your trees, you have AI thermal mapping of the trees, etc. So it becomes real to you, your impact. So climate change and climate finance changes from something very abstract, which is at the institutional or government level, to something that's about you, your networks, and your behaviors.
And Marianne, I can't catch your eye because your camera's not on, but can I just ask you a question? So I get it. So the overlay, is that digitalization provides many new pathways for doing what Louise is doing in a specific context to address the dartboard that Roger set up. And it sounds like from your last example, we mustn't just think about finance as a way of putting that old-fashioned thing, money to invest in doing things. We need to understand finance also as part of a more complex formation of social identity and behavior and data flows and all sorts of other things. So kind of finance takes on a sort of broader systemic form. So the question is, all the examples you've given are from developing countries, and if I was being nationalistic, which is beyond my capability, I would be going, but surely, the titans of finance sit in London and New York and maybe Singapore. Surely all of the innovations must be coming from there. Have I got this totally wrong?
No, not at all. And I think that's sort of, that's how it is with waves of innovation. So Roger talked about waves of innovation, and we're sort of, with digital finance, we started with just doing the same thing we do. There was finance, just digital. And then we went into using data to do innovation. And now we're sort of standing in the next third wave, which is really plugging in more values. So green and social value into this digitization of finance. And that is much more happening in developing countries, maybe both because of a greater need, but also because there are fewer representatives of the old financial system, so incumbents in those markets. So there are fewer sort of, that system is weaker and the value is much clearer.
Good. Okay. And that also addresses maybe just a touch of the Ismail question about the place of incumbents and the dynamic between digital finance players and incumbents. So Roger, let me just sort of come back to you and maybe sort of turn you slightly away from kind of the dashboard or the dartboard that you described so well. And let's talk about the way financial and capital markets work. So I'm hearing lots about innovation, and obviously if one's sitting in the market, that's what one tends to talk about. But I'm wondering about whether policy and regulation plays a role here. Clearly there are upsides to the story, as we've seen from you and Louise and Marianne, but digitalization of finance carries risks and may not deliver these for good outcomes that they're both alluding to. So I wonder if you would speak to what that policy or regulatory agenda might look like.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about it relates to the area of green finance, then it's very relevant, because they are on the one side, you've got governments with their net zero and the Climate Change Act 2008 that we have and so on, driving government policy in a particular agenda. When it comes to the regulators, I think it's in either this sphere or the digital sphere, it's about the simplicity of measuring risk and looking for the opportunity, the investment opportunity, the commercial opportunity. And on the risk, where the Bank of England in particular has taken a great lead, is in saying to all the banks, look, if there's risk out there in climate, I want you to go and your corporates and measure it and tell me what it is. And they've got a big stress test exercise coming up next year on the climate exposure that our banks have. And I think many other central banks will look at this, and no doubt it'll take a few years to mature, but they will look at this and they will almost certainly copy the example of the Bank of England in doing this, because all of us believe there is climate risk there. It must be measurable, and it's measurable either because it's physical or because there's a political element to it. Nobody thought auto stocks, car stocks, Jaguar Land Rover was a climate risk stock until governments changed their mind on diesel engines. And suddenly, you know, they're also reevaluating and downgrading the risk registers for all our auto companies. On the digital side, it's of course another whole element, because we're constantly worried about the issue of cyber and of dealing with something we don't understand. But in financial technology, I would say, financial digital technology, there's a very good understanding, or much better understanding now than there was just a few years ago, of where the pitfalls are and where the opportunities are. In terms of encryption and security, I think we're in a different space from we were just even 2 or 3 years ago in terms of sophistication. Now, cyber fraud is also getting ever more complex. The fines, if you get it wrong, the fines from the regulator are pretty hefty, as a number of companies will testify. It's the same for banks. We make a single mistake on something, or something goes wrong. NatWest had it famously a few years ago. You'll get fined by the regulators. So it's very much in everybody's interest to be ahead of the game on this. I'm not sure that fully answers your question, but they have a real role to play, yes.
Okay, well, maybe we can just sort of build out from your comments and maybe turn to Louise. Louise, I think without telling secrets, it would be fair to say that crowdsourcing has struggled to find its place within the kind of broader financial markets, maybe partly because of growth pains, but also partly because of trying to find one's way in to enable citizens to really count in the way that you've described. Perhaps you could kind of walk us through slightly kind of what those challenges are, what kinds of financial policy and financial regulation are needed to enable citizens to have the kind of choice you're describing.
Yeah, that's a big question, but a very good one. I think I want to separate out two things, and in some ways kind of picking up on Ishmael's question around, how does digital finance challenge the incumbent banks? I mean, the incumbent banks are using digital finance. So I think we sort of need to separate the businesses that have chosen to kind of make digital finance, the way that they operate, from the outset, and kind of, digital finance is a means to an end. It's not a sort of end in itself, if that makes sense. So I suppose the point I'm making is that there is a massive shift going on in the world of finance, wealth, and investing. Businesses like ours and some other players are contributing to that shift, and they are shifting the way incumbent banks and institutional investors are beginning to act. So, and I made the comment about, at the end of the day, the school climate strikes that spread globally was all because we are so much more connected in a digital world. And in terms of our money, actually, what we are starting to do is, where we can, vote with it in different ways. There has been a pretty poor range of options in terms of what you can do, and it's not long when you have any discussion about ESG before greenwash comes up as a follow-on comment. But the point is, the conversation is being had, and the change is starting to happen, because people are looking for those options in the digital world. And the incumbents, whether it's banks or institutional investors, can see that, as well as the pressures that, I talked about central banks, and Roger highlighting again, in terms of these reporting frameworks that are coming in place increasingly. And that, to me, is all part of our digital world. And the businesses like ours, who have only ever existed in a digital way, it's yes, we need the help of regulators. Ultimately, the biggest influence, if you like, on our success are the macro drivers, whether that's the kind of political, the economic, and the regulatory frameworks. And it's been pretty unpredictable in the UK for the last 8 years, when we went from the greenest government ever to one that was kept removing green measures, to us now being a place where net zero 2050 became a legally binding objective in a heartbeat in normal kind of political timeframes. So I don't know if I'm putting that very well, but it's kind of separating what the digitalization of finance allows to happen within the to drive that bigger shift across the whole of the finance sector. And much as I want our business to kind of thrive and sweep away those incumbent players because, you know, they've shown themselves not fit and worthy to look after our planet and our money in a profit purpose aligned way, equally, you know, I'm really keen to see them make that shift in a way that allows small business like ours to thrive, because actually we can deliver it in a different but complementary way. Does that make sense?
Maybe one example of kind of, you know, if you had your regulator sitting in front of you right now, you know, what would you say to him or her, as to what they need to do to enable platforms like you that empower citizens to take more choice over their savings? What would that regulator have to do? Give us sort of more concrete example.
That they need to stop just regulating the finance. They've got to look at the purpose. And then they'll go away and say, well, that's not within our remit. And we'll say, well, go and make it your remit.
Okay.
Can I come in here, Simon? Because I think Ishmael's question on can green finance grow, it's this balance between the technology and the policy, which is exactly your field, which I think is so interesting. And I mentioned auto stocks as being something which nobody thought of as climate risk stocks. Now, that example can be extended into almost every single area of industry. And if we introduce a carbon tax, which is a government tool, say a £70 carbon tax across Europe, think what that does then to the returns on your stocks. And you begin to see real effect of political action onto financial results. So in answer to Ishmael's question, I think look at the politics and look at what governments are doing, taking that long-term view, the 30-year perspective, 50-year perspective on your short-term decision-making, and you come to some very interesting conclusions quickly about what looks good to have in your portfolio and what doesn't. I think that COVID has been a sort of an extraordinary acceleration of risk understanding. And it's no surprise that brown stocks have done badly and green stocks have done well in the last 6 months, as though a whole series of cataclysmic emotions and thoughts about our lives in the future have all come together into one. And guess what the result has been? It's been a very strong investment in ESG-related stocks, as Louise was saying. Sorry to come in now. I just thought it was a point worth making against Ishmael's question.
And what do you think about Louisa's suggestion that financial regulators, so forget the real economy for a minute, focus on the financial economy, that financial regulators need to focus more on the purpose of business?
You know, I honestly think business is already doing it. And I think Louise is right to say, let regulators do what they do best, and let business do what they do best. For instance, whilst you could say that BP and Shell have taken quite a long time to come around to a very green message, which they now put out, my goodness, you open up their annual report, you forget they're into oil and gas sometimes. But that is not the case on the economics of biodiversity, which we're looking at. You have 50 of the world's major trading companies, Unilever, Tesco, Mars, Trafigura, Cargill, shouting for proper regulation, saying we want to have a certification of food and textile produce coming from around the world in order that we can be on the right side of social sentiment and our share price doesn't fall as a result if we get it wrong. So I think that some businesses do respond to pressure. I would leave the regulators frankly out of that, which I think was what Louise was suggesting, and let the market take care of it.
So I think what Louise actually suggested was that financial regulators, so let's get back to the financial sector, financial regulators, not carbon regulators, should be regulating financial institutions around the purpose of business. Did I misunderstand that, Louise?
It's that we need to move away. You know, we have created a system that puts profit and the protection of money at the top, which is not what, you know, that's not consistent with a finite planet. It's not consistent with what we as humans value. So we will keep, you know, it's a bit like if you create an incentive scheme for your sales staff or your business or whatever it is, whatever you set as the incentives is what they'll go and deliver. We've kind of created a system that has profit, financial profit at the top, despite lots of best efforts, whether it's triple bottom line or, you know, still overall, or fiduciary duty. Still overall, we have a long way to go to unpick that. And certainly our regulator is always is always most focused on people's money rather than the combination of what the money does and its protection, if that makes sense. And it will always separate out, I'm not interested in what the money does, I'm just interested in how you're looking after the money. And that is inconsistent with a sustainable way of operating our system within our planetary means.
And maybe that kind of is an answer to Joe's question in the side notes, where he asks, is not one of the issues that financial regulators are inevitably conditioned by the current structure of the financial system? I mean, structure meaning probably a lot of things there, rather than regulating to create a fundamentally different financial system. Let me just jump to
climate as well. You know, it is back to this, you know, purpose is climate, but it's not just climate.
Got it. Marianne, you've been very patient. Let me kind of bring you into this policy and regulatory discussion. It seems to me, you know, you're more conversant perhaps with, you know, what a lot of the regulators are doing in other parts of the world, as well as in Europe, but also you're looking at the bleeding edge of where fintech can make a difference, which perhaps is a sort of different space where standards and regulations may or may not count. What would you be pushing financial regulators to do if one wanted to advance a sort of sustainability aligned digital finance system?
Yeah, I think I want to first of all go back to another seminar, or we had a Geneva launch of the task force report where we had the central governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Patrick, and he started out saying, my mandate is to democratize finance. So of course that he positioned himself totally different, and his role totally different. Of course, coming from a developing country, you will have a broader mandate, but it was a very interesting way of putting how he sees himself. And I agree with Louise that definitely we could look at even more progressive regulators. We have the NGFS, we have a lot of movement that has been going on, but we could look at sort of fast track licensing for those that are SDG compliant. We could look at those fintechs that are really sort of trying to plug more value into how they design stable coins or a new generation of money to give them more access to the central bank, for instance. We could think it in that way. But then I think regulation only gets you so far. And I think parts of it is in the industrial policy, where we need to be more ambitious, at least in the level, and we need to be taking on less the hat of the regulator, which is more conservative and trying to preserve what is, into really building digital finance of tomorrow. And here I'm especially thinking about infrastructure. I mean, everybody's looking at what's coming out of China, since Xi Jinping in November of 2019 said that blockchain is elevated to a national priority. And in April, they launched what is called the BSN, so the Business Services Network. It's the largest DLT or blockchain platform in the world. It has 28 city nodes and it has 8 nodes outside of China. So now if you want to do business, financial business in China, you need to comply with the Chinese encryption standards in order to access the market. So they are they're shifting their focus away from sort of trying to win social and search to really winning the infrastructure of the financial system of tomorrow. And there, I think in a few years, we will have a few of those platforms, which will be the new type of internet for building everything in digital finance. And one of them will definitely be the standards of China. Another one may be the standards of US. But I think the European Union needs to get in there and also build that type of infrastructure or figure out what we want to do. Because when you build that type of infrastructure, what China is also doing is drastically reducing the costs of startups to build fintech solutions on DLT. So they will attract quite a lot of those that are interested in that. And then at the same time, making these green finance test zones, test beds, etc. So really trying to plug some green thinking into that. I think that's where we as the European Union needs to start to think because what is going on now is that a lot of the fintechs in the European Union, they're getting their backend developed in Ukraine or somewhere else because it's simply too expensive here and it's just not conducive here. So we have to think it not only in the regulatory space, but also in the industrial policy space.
Okay, Marianne. So Roger, Louise, we're sort of coming up to time. So I just want to give kind of each of you kind of one more kind of shot at goal, if you like. I know that Radix is very focused on the policy and regulatory agenda, you know, both at a UK and a broader European level. Clearly, the topic is aligning the way in which digitalization is disrupting finance with broader sustainability outcomes. You know, perhaps starting with you, Roger, what would be not so much a silver bullet, but what would be the critical policy or regulatory steps you would push, maybe just one in the finance side to kind of advance that agenda?
Carbon tax.
Right.
As simple as that. I think if we introduce I mean, we're again back to Ishmael's question. How do you marry this, the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of the horizons? How do you marry that 30-year risk with a 3-month investment outlook? Something like carbon tax does that. £70 a ton would start to make a real difference. Of course, it then has to declare an interest working for a Swedish bank. Sweden already has a carbon tax of well over €100. So it hurt them least because they're already used to it. But a carbon tax will bring that long-term thinking into short-term investment making. And that to me would be one of the most effective things we could do. I'm afraid it's not digital, but it would certainly have a dramatic effect on the market.
Turns out the carbon markets can't function without a digital architecture, but nevertheless,
Exactly. I think Louise actually put it exactly right earlier when she said it's a tool, not a means, not an end in itself. So, of course, we use digital techniques to promote it and trade it.
Fantastic. Louise, last call from you. What would be not so much the main push in order to advance abundance, but kind of what would you be saying to financial policy and regulators?
I guess just picking up on my last comment, these questions are always so difficult, but you know, if I, you know, being put on the spot, I'm going to say that we cannot separate profit and purpose anymore, at all, in any way, shape or form.
Okay, all right, that sounds good.
There must be a digital way to deliver that in a way that we would never have been able to date.
And certainly history is leaning with you as we see more and more financial regulators and standard setters drawing sustainability in many different ways into their deliberations. Okay, so firstly, thanks to the three of you very much indeed. I think the exam question or homework that you gave us, Joe, at the beginning of the session was social return of fintech. You know, is it for real or not for real? I think we see perhaps the inevitable spread on the answer, which is it absolutely can be. There are many examples of ways in which it is. There are many illustrations of where it has almost nothing to do with a kind of broad social good agenda. And actually, as both Roger and Louise have said, you know, this is an instrumental part of the overall equation, and we need to get that broader market and policy architecture right, both in the financial economy, perhaps radically set out by Louise, and also in the real economy, for example, in the area of carbon taxes. With that.